Bonjour, bonsoir à tous. Alors, comme nos invités sont tous anglophones, on va parler en anglais. Donc, je pense que vous avez tous des casques de traduction. Ou alors, ça ira pour les autres. Okay. Donc, je vais introduire en anglais. Bon, first of all, thank you all for coming to this talk. This discussion. We are very, very happy to have those wonderful guests tonight with us in the School of Versailles. It's an honor and a pleasure, obviously, that they accepted to do those beautiful installations in the Cour des Fontaines that you all already saw, I think. So I'm going to present the great people we have here tonight. The talks will be in two parts. First part with the first row of guests, and the second part starting at 7, a bit after 7, with the other guests. So our guests tonight are Mary Dugan, Steve Webb, Anton Garcia Abril, and Debora, and Guillaume Ramillien, right? Mary Dugan is with her engineer Steve Webb, and they work together on this pavilion. Mary Dugan is a British architect. She set her own office in 2017, right? She worked previously as an office called Dugan Maurice. And well, I'm going to be short, but she won a lot of prizes. She did a lot of buildings that are more beautiful, but working alone since 2017. Your work is more focused on a more experimental approach of architecture. I think a more plastical one also that we found very interesting, and that's why we invited you here for these pavilions. So, not going to more detail to save time for you guys to talk. Anton and Debora, you founded the office Ensemble Studio in the year 2000, I guess. You are based in Madrid, but also in Boston. You teach a lot as well. Anton, you teach in MIT, and Debora in Georgia Tech, right? You have been conducting experiments also on the matter and the potential of matter in architecture in a very stunning way. We visited your Fabrica in Madrid, an amazing place where you are doing these experiments, scale 1-to-1 for projects all over the world, and especially right now a project in Korea, which is the base of your pavilion that you are going to talk a little bit tonight. That's why also you are with Guillaume tonight, who is the landscape designer of this project in Korea, which is the base of the installation there. So I'm going to leave you here to talk and to present a little bit your thoughts on those questions that we ask you. How can form emerge from those questions of matter and energy? Please welcome Anton, Debora, Guillaume, Mary, and Steve tonight. Thank you. Comme vous voulez.
Alors bonjour, en fait, je vais commencer en français quand même. J'ai la chance d'être français, je suis quand même beaucoup plus à l'aise en français qu'en anglais. Donc voilà, si on peut avoir le premier slide. Alors je vous parlais des Jardins de Médangol en fait. Les Jardins de Médangol, c'est un magnifique projet dont Anton est l'architecte qui fait une partie, enfin qui fait le Visitor Center. Voilà. Donc les Jardins de Médangol, c'est un jardin français en Corée du Sud. Alors, est-ce que vous connaissez un peu l'histoire de la Corée? C'est vrai qu'on connaît vraiment l'histoire des jardins japonais, on connaît un peu l'histoire des jardins chinois, mais relativement peu l'histoire des jardins coréens. Les Coréens, ce sont... slide suivante, j'ai oublié le petit micro, excusez-moi. Donc les jardins coréens, déjà, c'est l'esprit cénobi. Autant les Japonais sont des guerriers, autant les Coréens sont vraiment des érudits. Voilà, donc ils sont toujours vraiment à la recherche de sagesse, de connaissance et d'humilité. Ils sont vraiment précurseurs, en fait, ils ont un peu j'allais dire, cette sagesse à la fois très sobre, très simple, que je trouve vraiment très intéressante et très actuelle. Donc la Corée, si vous connaissez un peu, avant 1950, il n'y avait absolument rien. Et depuis la guerre de Corée, en fait, il y a eu un boom économique extraordinaire. C'est vraiment un miracle économique. Et ils ont depuis, en fait, ils ont grossi très vite, ils ont grandi très vite, et ils ont l'envie de redécouvrir un peu des beautés simples et de s'ouvrir aux cultures, aux nouveaux arts. Alors ils ont déjà évidemment des artistes et des architectes qui sont formidables, mais ils ont envie de redécouvrir un peu la complexité du jardin, la complexité végétale et voilà, tout ce qu'il y a autour de ça. Ils ont surtout l'envie de partager, de renouveler, de faire progresser l'art du jardin. Ils ont un art du jardin qui est vraiment très intéressant, qui emprunte, comme je vous l'ai dit, de sobriété, d'humilité et de sagesse. Mais ils ont envie de renouveler un peu cet art, notamment en s'inspirant des jardins à la française, qui ont la force d'une structure assez présente. Alors, quel parti pris pour ces jardins? Voilà. Alors, on m'a demandé, en fait, moi je suis donc paysagiste, et on m'a demandé en fait de dessiner ces jardins, et on m'a demandé de raconter une histoire. Voilà. Alors, c'est un jardin qui se divise en 6 parties, dans lequel il y a l'histoire de la Corée, et après il y a une partie plus philosophique sur Nietzsche, sur Le Petit Prince, sur Kazan de Sakis. Il y aura également un jardin Belle Époque. Donc, c'est des jardins assez conceptuels. Mais en fait, l'objectif, c'est derrière le concept, c'est d'avoir toute la poésie due à la complexité végétale. C'est-à-dire que j'aurai un trait assez fort, j'ai pas le choix d'avoir un trait assez fort parce qu'en fait, les hivers sont très rigoureux. Donc en fait, si on veut qu'il y ait une lisibilité, quelle que soit la saison, il faut avoir un trait assez fort. Et après, la complexité végétale, c'est-à-dire le fouillis, voilà, qui sera par les graminées, les vivaces, en espérant qu'elles tiennent, apportera la poésie à l'ensemble. Alors je vous présente le projet dans son ensemble. Donc, vous avez le jardin traditionnel coréen, donc, qui est fait par un architecte paysagiste coréen. Il y a toute la forêt qui sera en haut, qui sera vraiment dédiée aux arts, dans laquelle il y aura 2 galeries d'art là, pour recevoir des collections soit permanentes, soit des collections de façon épisodique. Et vous avez un ensemble de jardins contemporains. Donc, il y a toute une série qui va être donc, les jardins liés à l'histoire de la Corée. Donc, on part en fait de la terre des érudits, Land of Scholars, pour finir en fait sur la Corée moderne et sur le futur de la Corée. Je vous parlais également de jardins plus philosophiques, autour du Petit Prince notamment, autour voilà. Alors, pour l'instant, c'est un plan qui est assez succinct. Évidemment, là, on est en pleine construction. Donc, dans quelques années, vous aurez l'occasion, si vous avez la chance d'aller en Corée, de découvrir les jardins de Médongol. Voilà. Donc, je vous disais un peu l'esprit de ce jardin, c'est d'avoir un trait relativement fort pour avoir une lisibilité. Donc, c'est en fait pour que le jardin soit compréhensible, quelle que soit la saison, et qu'en hiver, quand les hivers sont voilà, neigeux ou extrêmement froids, ça descend en -23 là-bas, avec le mois de juin qui est complètement humide, il pleut tous les jours, donc ils ont une mousson. Donc il faut vraiment trouver la gamme végétale qui résiste à ça, et qui soit suffisamment riche pour vraiment voilà, provoquer de l'émotion. Donc il y a une complexité végétale à réinventer. Et également, surtout un équilibre à trouver entre le concept. Alors le concept c'est toujours très intéressant, mais en fait quand on est dans un espace, la première intelligence c'est celle des yeux, celle voilà, de l'œil, on voit on comprend ce qu'on voit. Ensuite c'est celle du cœur, on essaie de ressentir des émotions, et seulement après vient l'intelligence du cerveau où on comprend le concept. Donc la difficulté en fait, c'est de trouver un équilibre entre le concept et la poésie, pour que ce soit à la fois des jardins dans lesquels on se sente bien, mais qui ait un supplément d'âme avec une compréhension plus intellectuelle. Voilà, donc c'est sur une surface de 18 hectares. Donc voilà, maintenant j'ai le plaisir de vous présenter Anton, qui va faire le Visitor Center, en fait, qui se trouve à l'entrée des jardins, vous voyez, le pavé noir, là, qui n'est pas forcément mis à l'honneur sur ce plan, mais qui est un magnifique projet, voilà, par Anton et Debora. Merci.
Thank you, Guillaume, for the introduction. So I think with the introduction that Guillaume was doing, you can get a sense of the context where the project that we are exhibiting, which is a small part of a larger project, is located. And then you will understand why we're working in architecture that becomes a landscape, and how important this is as we are designing the entrance pavilion, let's say the threshold that will take you from the outside of this garden and will bring you into paradise. So our project wants to be an atmosphere that creates this transition and creates this transition through an itinerary where materiality and how architecture reacts to different energies has a lot of importance. And this is also why we call it the cloud, not just because of how the building sits on the ground, but how it becomes almost like an energized architecture. We also want to mention in this project we are collaborating, or in this garden, also other great architects are participating, Mauricio Pezzo and Sofia von Elrichhausen, and they are doing another series of architectures, and we are focused on the entrance that Anton will explain. We've decided to create a video for this presentation that will take you in a journey from our early works and how we start to work with architecture and landscape and how we start to connect with the earth, with the ground, in order to produce a space. Then we'll explain the making, the behind the scenes of the installation that you are seeing that we prefabricated in our space in Madrid and we brought here and assembled. And finally, how this becomes an important part of the research, of the development, also of the project that will happen in South Korea. So hopefully you will understand a bit with more depth what we are displaying in the courtyard.
Thank you. So video in, por favor. S'il vous plaît. So I actually lived in Paris for 1 year in the Rue Le Pic, but we were there having dinner 2 days ago, but I cannot speak French. Yeah, so this is the story of our practice that has been always ligated to the earth. We started working in quarries. These were our first projects, and we have evolved our architecture language, trying to get rid of architecture dogmas, try to get rid of its impositions, its geometries, its systems, and try to subdue to the logic of the earth, and finding a new natural expressionism that we think is what will connect us deeper and more profoundly with our world. Here we're showing our office, our lab, that somehow expresses this connection even in our working environment. I will go into that in detail, but we wanted to start this short presentation of ENSAMBLE Studio through a very vintage video of Debora and myself, pretty much kids, learning about the architecture of the earth, what it meant to operate with it, where it's sourced, where it comes from. And in this quarry, we were recycling big boulders and trying to give them order in a Palladian somehow structure, no? Structure to be felt rather than to be measured in its dimensions. No? Here we were learning the expressivity and the tectonics of a new way, and also a very ancient way to comprehend architecture, no? Where the equilibrium and the statics were predominant versus the aesthetics, no? Or the language. No? We were, in our early works, when I still have a black hair, we were obsessed with this itinerary through a new architecture that could connect us in a different way with the earth. And our first projects, as you can see, we're trying to enhance this communion, to create this dialogue. No? These projects were based in Santiago Compostela, a place where nature is so present and history is also very well rooted in the terrain. No? This project, the Truffle, was a little bit more of music, please. Was a small poem about nature, that we use the material of the available immediate source of the parcel to mix them in an unprecedented way and to emulate a fabrication process, no? Like editing, manufacturing, like an early 3D printer. But what we wanted really was to create this dish, this contained soil wall, and a volume of hay that could be filled up with this geopolymer as a mixture of concrete, earth, and all kind of materials that were immediately in contact with that site. What we obtained was a strange materiality that initially had frightened us, but immediately seduced us because it was really disrupting certain aspects of architecture and the modernity, but it was deeply connecting with the place. And 10 years after this project, we had another opportunity to work with an extraordinary landscape, in this case the Rocky Mountains, very close to Yellowstone Park in the state of Montana, where we were given the opportunity to operate in this very, very untouched wilderness with the perspective of the Rocky Mountains, and the only reference as geometry as the print of the stars, this constellation that was somehow the only map without any further urban or scalar references to determine, the tracks and the connections among the different parts of the place. We were commissioned to create these entries, the portals, and to create also a room where music could be projected towards nature in a different way of feeling this art, architecture, and music encounter. And all our architecture was based in this earthed casts, where we celebrated these moments of gravitas, of unearthing, as the birth of an early expression of architecture. This early expression had no geometry, had no, let's say, immediate links with the history of architecture, but it was deeply connected with the geology of the place, the tectonics of the earth, and ultimately to ourselves through the earth. So these connected projects exploited when we found Canterra. Canterra is the house of the earth. It's our landscape lab where we work. When we are in Spain on season, the projects that are related to the landscape. We want to connect with this space physically and spiritually, and dedicate our time to practice architecture in its own place of the landscape. This video that we're showing you shows the moment where with deep emotion we found the place totally abandoned and dirty, and but we immediately felt and scanned the potential of transforming that dark, dirty hole into an amazing architecture space. These beautiful drawings are just the prints of the 3D scan, where these extraordinary eyes were capable to read the space. We just had to imagine that all that substance and substrates and printed dirt through all those layers in the walls and the space, they just needed the sensibility and the look of architecture to transform it into an habitable space. And we wanted to celebrate this transformation by a very architectonic action like cleaning and providing the main ground, finding where stone was giving support, and also creating this performative action that celebrates the birth of architecture just by the drop of this stone and the apparition of the light and the air as the main energies together with the gravity that would somehow symbolize the creation of an architecture space. And after we just took care of it, the little tree, after the impact, needed a little bit of care, but nature always survives. So we just watered and gave it a little bit of love and care. And that was the architecture of the earth that we wanted to create in Canterra. So, and this is all our life until we arrived to Korea. We were invited by the one family to create this entrance, this portal to Le Jardin de Médangol, to create this cloud as a metaphor of the water that will give life to the garden as a symbol. So we went to Canterra. We spent that time needed to create that connection. And with the freedoms that we had learned and practiced all our prior life, we created this wave of matter, this airy flower of Le Jardin de Médangol that could be part of that topography. It's an architecture that has given up its geometry into a very, I would say, strong materiality and a space that flows and anticipates the garden that will create the itinerary. So when we were invited to this extraordinary biennale, we wanted to bring a little part of this structure of the cloud. So this is not a pavilion, it's actually a pixel, a 50th part in a one-to-one scale of the structure of the cloud of Le Jardin de Médangol. As you can see, we wanted to create this petal of lightness. We created this structure that is the mold of the mineral structure based in concrete and geopolymers that will create the space. So this contradictory lightness, the invisible part of the structure, but is what gives form and consistency and shape and texture, is what we brought to Versailles as an homage to the landscape nature of this place. As you can see outside, it's a very, very light petal or a leaf that we had to prefabricate, cut, transport, and reassembly. Because the architecture of the earth needs all the contemporary technologies, from parametric, finite systems, high sophisticated engineering, to all kinds of software to render it, and also the applications of off-site technologies, how you can fabricate a mold in Madrid that will have a first stop in Versailles, but it will end up in Korea. I think this is the world that we live in, and we wanted to bring a spot, a pixel, an aroma of this Le Jardin de Médangol all the way to Versailles, and create this connection between the two fabulous landscape traditions of the East and the Western civilizations and cultures. I think the earth united us, and here is where, through the landscape, we can find the real connections that architecture today creates in our global culture. I think architecture is not anymore about style or systems. I think today architecture has to find its language and its position in the environment, not only as a parametric carbon footprint action, but also as a cultural and spiritual connection with ourselves. And that's what we are so excited, why we're so excited to work in Korea, in this museum space, this exhibition space, this welcoming center that offers this atmosphere of lightness under this crust of earth that will anticipate a fantastic journey through the history of gardens. And in this history, we want to create this first flower. As you can see, the site is already under construction, and the reality will be much more extraordinary than the fiction of the project. So we're very happy to start this journey, sharing it with you guys here in Versailles. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much. That was a lovely presentation, really beautiful. Ours is a little bit different. Yes.
Antonio was composing the music for his several years ago. We worked ours out in the cafe this afternoon, complete with salad. And,
Oh, wow. Okay. So I'll start by, I think, placing this project in the context of my practice and Steve's practice, so Mary Dugan and Webb Yates. I think it's just really lovely to be given the opportunity to really kind of test your design principles. I'm a London-based practitioner. Most of my projects are driven by largely commercial or domestic briefs. So the structure of my practice is very much to respond to those, quite specifically in kind of square meter areas in very particular material terms. So this question that's raised by the brief that focuses on the parable, the Brain of Banham parable, which talks about a tribe coming into a forest. The tribe is presented with some timber, and they are given this option to either construct a structure and take shelter from the environment, or to actually use the timber to create energy and to create heat and to keep themselves warm. It sort of poses a kind of interesting cultural problem on one hand, how do we respond, how do we build architecture, but also more fundamentally, what is the fate of materials? And that's been the core subject that Steve and I have been examining through the course of this project. I think it's fair to say that I set out not really knowing what we'd end up with, and I think that's the true test. And it's been a project that I've been worried about. I think we're probably all architects in the room, and you wonder whether you've got something right or wrong, and you stress about it and try and place it in the context of architecture that you actually have to deliver, because I think these experiments, which is what this brief is inviting us to do, really needs to inform the real world of architecture. So these initial slides, our plan was to have the slides on a loop. But this is a model that's been sitting on my desk. I've been looking at the model, looking at the project slowly emerging and playing the two off each other as I go along. I'll hand over to Steve now, who'll set a different tone to the conversation.
Perhaps. So my practice is Webiates. We're engineers. There are quite a few of us. There are 60 of us, in fact. And we've always been very aware of climate change and of embodied carbon, but we're an engineering practice and we're designing lots of big things with concrete and steel. There were the climate change marches in London 2 or 3 years ago, and my staff were asking me, can we go and join the march? Can we have the day off to join the march? And I was thinking, who are they protesting against? Who's the problem here? People who are making lots of carbon. Isn't that us? So we're going to join the climate change protest as sympathizers, but actually we're the perpetrators. We're the specifiers of a lot of steel and a lot of concrete. But we've always pushed for timber and for other materials. And I think very essentially, and this is the extension of the parable that Mary's talking about, fire. Fire is how we know that materials are highly energetic. Fire is the transformation of fossil fuels into carbon. Fire is what makes materials strong, transforms iron ore into iron, transforms limestone into cement, creates materials of high strength through the application of huge amounts of energy. So when we're thinking about specifying materials, we need to think, does the material come from fire, or does it not come from fire? Is it highly transformed, manipulated with huge amounts of energy, or is it a different kind of material? The use of fire to make iron ore into steel leads to an architecture of strength. So I've just come back from New York, incredibly bombastic steel skyscrapers and buildings. In London, we're full of high-tech steel braces and materials that are very strong. Architecture quite often is the kind of search for leanness, for sveltness and thinness and fineness and impossible gravity-defying structures in concrete and steel. And this has really become the way that many people design. The other thing that we often think about on the other side of this is that there's a kind of fiscal bias. So in about 1820, William Pitt the Younger decided to put income tax on people, whereas hitherto they taxed windows, bizarrely. The taxation of human beings disincentivizes labor. There's no such tax on robots or machines. And so there's a natural fiscal incentive to minimize labor, and particularly in Western economies, to minimize labor and to maximize material usage through rationalization. So the whole kind of fiscal system is set up in a way that promotes machine, material, energy use over craft and work, labor, and thought by human beings.
So we're still in our main salad. So I suppose that the start point for the project, the second title, so the title of the pavilion is called A Pavilion Made of Gypsum, Then Stone and Wood, is actually a clear description of our design process. So what we do in our practice is, we love materials. So the second title is For the Love of Materials. The way we tend to work as architects is we will run through a design process, and I think most of you who are in practice, you'll know this, that the process for testing buildings tend to be material X, Y, and Z gets reviewed in an iterative way. It gets evaluated for its viability, for its cost, and then the choice will come out of that. What we wanted to do, and what we do as a practice, Steve and I are working on a house in Somerset that's made entirely of stone that's salvaged from local quarries within the region of Somerset. And we're working on another project in the centre of London that can only be built of we wanted to build it out of wood, solely of wood, with some hybrid steel, to kind of really celebrate one single material. So our approach to the brief here, the brief being the pavilion is made of gypsum, was to fully understand the qualities of gypsum, to fall in love with gypsum, and to imagine a scenario where the building is only made of that single material. And to do that, you need to understand its full characteristics. So we know and we understand that gypsum can exist in powder, in liquid form, in board, and it's made into blocks. And it's incredibly plastic and malleable. It can be carved by hand with a saw and formed into pretty much any shape or form. So our process, if you take the notion that you have an iterative process of materials that get whittled to one that functions and fits a program, is largely driven by cost, what we wanted to do was to say, this is only gypsum, so the start point is gypsum. We're going to push it to its limit. So now that you're hopefully familiar with the structure, we pushed it to its limits. We created a form that extruded to an extreme high point, to the point where it failed, actually. So we'd have some models that demonstrated that the structure reached at a stage where it was at a point of failure. And at that point, we started to engage with other materials and started considering a process of mending. So the stone clasp is there intended to create a place in the structure in order to repair the broken gypsum, which would then receive the timber prop, and so forth. So a sequence of processes of craft, of engagement with the material and honing the material, followed in a true sequence in order to allow each individual material to find its own rhythm, to find its own characteristics and its place in the structure.
Yeah, so we think in this respect that this is an architecture of weakness and an architecture of vulnerability. So rather than, I think, a usual architectural response, the desire to have a gypsum blue box with big fins and extended planes, it's quite a difficult engineering thing to make work, and the usual solution would be stick a load of bits of steel in it and clad it in gypsum or some kind of solution of that kind. So what we've done here is try to find a solution that accepts the weakness of the gypsum and, as Mary says, to repair it with the addition of timber props, and the props being handmade elements and hand-connected. We set ourselves and we often do this with many projects actually, we set ourselves a little constraint, which is that we're not going to have screws, we're not going to have glue, we're going to let the wood do what it wants to do. And so all of the connections, you'll notice, are little bits of timber and wedges, and this is a theme that runs through our work, that we express the joints and the connections, and the kind of symbolism in this project is that we're using craft and labor instead of material, instead of hiding big lumps of steel.
So I think just to kind of close out perhaps what we've learned. So we have produced a project which I don't think either of us were particularly clear. Is it a form of architecture? Is it an uncomfortable structure? Is it a form of architecture that's born out of pure material characteristics or structural principles? It has this strange kind of ecclesiastical quality. You know, we've talked to people about it. It has a kind of a feeling of a small chapel defined by these pieces, which are genuinely and actually born out of the material dictating its failure point, and therefore the principles that have been deployed in order to repair it have resulted in a kind of very a project that I feel celebrates material detail and material that goes into a kind of mending kind of architecture. Yeah, that's the project.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your work and sharing it with us. It's so interesting. At the beginning, we had imagined to split the conversation between the both of you first, and then with LCLA and BAUKUNST. But because time is running so fast, we're going to continue directly with the lecture, and then we're going to have a discussion all together, if you're okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Alors par contre, comment on fait pour les fauteuils? Il faudrait peut-être ramener... Après, on aura besoin de plus de fauteuils, non? Enfin, pendant qu'ils vont commencer à parler, on ira. Ouais. Je vais faire avec... Et Louis, s'il arrive. On va attendre que Louis arrive pour présenter tout le monde, peut-être. Hein?
Louis is dealing with the technicians. Have you finished, Louis?
Tu le vois? Do you know where he is? Non, mais ça va, je pense qu'il va arriver. Okay, so we are going to start waiting for Luis, who is trying to upload the, the document. So we are also very happy to welcome tonight Adrien, Luis, and Charlotte, who did the other pavilions, that the other installation that you saw in the Cour des Fontaines. So first, yes, he's here. First, let me introduce you to Adrien Verschuere, who is the founder of the office called BAUKUNST. Adrien, you founded the office in 2017, right? A bit earlier. That's what. All right. You're a Belgian architect based in Brussels. Previously, you worked at Herzog & de Meuron, OMA. You were the founder of the office called Made in Geneva. And you have been doing an amazing body of work, I think we all know today. Also building, but also teaching as well in the EPFL. And what kind of convinced me more to invite you here is the teaching that you do, that we're focusing on energy and the potential of the architectural potential of energetic devices that you studied with your students. So the installation that you did for us in the Cour des Fontaines is kind of related to those questions that are, I think, important to you, and you are going to explain a bit more all of this. So thank you for being there. Luis and Charlotte, you are, Luis Callejas, you are a Colombian architect. Charlotte, you are Swedish. You both work in Oslo. I don't know when you founded the office or in because your previous office, I'm a bit confused. The previous office was Paisajes Emergentes. It was based in Colombia. And you moved to Norway? 2014, all right. And your work is at the limit of the landscape and architecture. Maybe you started more from the landscape perspective, and your work has been dealing a lot with the question of water, of hydrology. That's not the only concern you have, but we discussed several times about those questions and how they can stimulate the architecture discourse. So that's also what kind of motivated you in doing this installation in the Cour des Fontaines, a pond mostly, but you like to present it as a scale model. Charlotte and Luis, we are very happy to have you here tonight. So I want you to welcome Adrien, Luis, and Charlotte tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas. So it's not really supposed to be a lecture, but I think we prepare all few slides to, let's say, share what we've done, but also to explain a bit more what we try to do beside this specific project. So I will maybe quickly explain the installation and give few words about two other projects that somehow are a bit related to what we've done here in Versailles. Of course, doing an installation is a bit of an issue for an architect. So somehow what we kind of start with is to, as we always start, to read the place. And then let's say that the court was obvious to work with. We would like to engage the space as a whole and to somehow imagine an installation that would perform with the space. What we would like also to address through the installation is, here we see the space, of course, and one of the main elements we were immediately fascinated was the big wall that is the limit between, let's say, the outside of the site and the inside of the school. So we kind of had immediately the intuition to work with this architectural feature. Oh, that's a nice distortion. And then we also realized that by starting with this let's say, very primitive architectural element. We try to observe it as a potential of capturing the sun and capturing the light. So we did few research to understand better how this wall will behave towards the sun. And we noticed somehow that the sun is coming, let's say, from 8 to 12, so it has a kind of a limited impact. And somehow we wanted to play with the fact that the sun is visible at some point and will disappear on the afternoon. But I guess we were also quite interested about bringing, let's say, this architectural feature as the wall, as being part of a more general understanding of the site. We kind of notice here in Versailles that you kind of find and discover a lot of ornaments that are set up on these walls. We did a bit of a research about the history and then somehow also the reason of these ornaments. Kind of discovered that some of these elements were a bit symbolizing also energy. They were, let's say, relic of ancient light and ancient way of heating buildings. And so these basically are, let's let's say, the ingredients of the installation that you could see in the court. We wanted to somehow to bring the installation into also a kind of a metaphorical reading. And of course, that was a very obvious also link to the Roi Soleil and how somehow this very important element could be also be celebrated. So sorry, the drawings are not appearing okay, but I think if you saw the installation, I guess you can imagine. So we imagine with a designer, a textile designer, Chevalier Masson, kind of a long curtain that could capture the sun and somehow restitutes, so it captures the morning and then it restitutes the afternoon. And we kind of place 4 devices that are enabling to transform the solar energy into sound through the way it's somehow receiving light and sun. So ultimately we wanted to address the space of the courtyard with sound, and this is basically the scheme showing, let's say, both the curtain and the speakers that you all saw in the court. I guess this question of energy, as you mentioned, Nicolas, is something very important that we research at in the FFL in Lausanne. Somehow what we address is we kind of make the assumption why, if, let's say, the new program of architecture could be energy, and how could we respond to this? We all know architecture has a kind of a quality of being a media between inside, outside, which is dealing, of course, with comfort and thermical and all sort of agents. And this is a competition proposal we've done that somehow speak a bit about this research. So the competition was asking for a public space that you see here at the middle of the slide here. A very nice site that somehow make the ancient wall between the medieval city and then the more classical city in Geneva. And somehow the task or the brief was also covering from direct sunlight vestige of the ancient wall that they found somehow under the plaza. They were asking for a pavilion that somehow would cover this space and protect those vestiges from the light. And we found a bit of a contradiction of building a piece of architecture there and then somehow letting the view that you saw or that you have to imagine on the image there, on the view on the lake and view on the mountain from the top of the medieval city. And so we imagined a device somehow that could capture, again, light, create energy. I mean, the vestiges were supposed to be also controlled thermically, but also in terms of hygrometry. So we kind of cover with a glass roof the vestige, and then we imagine this umbrella both capturing the sun and also providing the shadows on the vestige. I mean, as you see here in the section, we really would like that the public space and the continuity of the ground would be kept. And this is somehow the proposal. We also like the idea that this feature could make somehow an artifact in the city and be also in interaction, not only with, let's say, elements like the light and shadows, but also, let's say, address this new public space again. Maybe another complete different project we won a few years ago in La Défense here in Paris. We were asked somehow to rediscover the underground of this space. You probably all know the Grande Arche. What we also know is like you have a lot of networks under the big esplanade, And the competition was somehow addressing all those space, leftover space that you have to imagine underground and in between the different infrastructure, subway, highway, metro station. Here we see the different layers of the neighborhood. So we all know the big towers, La Grande Arche and the Esplanade. We were somehow asked to investigate about what is invisible and to readdress those space into, let's say, public space. So when you go down, you can find this fantastic structure, underground structure. This one is called the cathedral. That was not supposed to be inhabited. The brief was, again, to wonder if this space could be once inhabited on one side, and on the other side, we also have a mission or a brief to imagine new program inside this infrastructure. So I will not tell you the whole story. Here you can see the footprint of what they call the volume résiduel, which is the space where we work. And we wanted to address this space through, again, energy and the reading of energy. So for this project, we work with AtmosLab, let's say climatic engineers, that helps us to understand how energy is conveying into this space. But even more, how do we address the question of comfort into the public space? This is a map showing the level of the Esplanade. It's a concrete, a very exposed surface. You have to imagine it was very, very warm during summer and very windy during winter because of the towers. And by, let's say, exploring the underground and then reprogramming the underground, we wanted to kind of offer another kind of climatic condition. As you know, if you go underground, you get much more inertia. This is a scheme showing somehow how these space underground react through time. And the first operation that we did is completely different, or almost somehow contradictory to what we used to do. It's like somehow taking out, let's say, the skin of part of the skin of the Esplanade to make again the connection between the space below and then the upper space. Just by providing these connections, then we were studying how light, but also how natural ventilation could inform the way we will inhabit it and the way we will divide the different space underground. So here it's again a scheme of AtmosLab showing both light and air condition into the underground space. These are the bones. Somehow, I mean, we kind of propose to, again, dig the different volumes and to make the different volumes connected again. And then we add few very local devices responding to ventilation, natural ventilation, but also accessibility, and then a few, let's say, technical elements that you have to provide to be able to bring people there, like a fire installation. And here we see the different layers coming together. One of these device will be providing light, so it's we call it a trémiagam. So it's a small pavilion that will be popping up from the public space, but that will also ventilate the space from down to top. And this is somehow an image. We kind of investigate a lot on this project also through images to understand how light enter those space and how this very simple action of demolition could be, let's say, the main element of the project. Thank you.
see if it works. Yeah, so we are LCLA office, and we, Luis, Callejas, and me, as was mentioned, we are an office that has worked a lot in the intersection between landscape and architecture, and a theme that we have been very interested in for a long time is the plasticity of scale. That is big inspiration also for this installation we have done in the courtyard, the pond. And yes, we'll talk a little bit more about that in relation to what we have done here, but also other projects. And 20 minutes, or what we have, is not so much, so Luis will run you through it quickly.
All right, I think we can move to our presentation. Is it ready? Oh, yes. Yes, as Nicolas said, we have worked with water, but it's not really our specialty. But it is a fertile medium for expression. It's a material that has no shape. And therefore, there has to be some kind of shape, some kind of system to produce architecture with it. So even though I very much agree that some architecture might not need systems or geometry, you do need some kind of idea and decision in terms of geometry when you're dealing with these media that is formless, basically. This drawing on the screen is not ours. This is Asplund and Leverens. It's a drawing of it's actually my favorite drawing of the beautiful woodland cemetery in Stockholm. It is the drawing of the ceremonial pond. It's a drawing that I like to start with this because what do we mean by the plasticity of scale? Well, we work a lot in plan. We work with landscape, we work with architecture, and we have been interested in architects that some admitted, some don't. I think these two guys didn't admit this, but they were, I mean, very serious architects, but I think they had also a kind of playful side. As you might know, Leverens was into designing lamps and light fixtures, and I mean, this ceremonial pond has a, I don't think it's a coincidence that the drawing of the ceremonial pond has a resemblance with a light fixture. I have no evidence of that connection, but I think it's up to us to make that connection, and this is the kind of stuff that we're interested in. And the drawings that allow us to move freely between the scale of a detail all the way to the scale of a landscape. This is a water feature, by the way. Obviously, it's a pond. And when Nicolas and Guillaume asked us about energy and materials, and it was a bit of a strange question for us because of course, we are interested in this, but when starting to do research about this space, which is fantastic, and where we are, we realized that I think especially many contemporary French architects are quite interested in this question of addressing the origins of architecture, or an architecture that can be originated through the study of pure energy. And strangely, right across, or not strangely, and this is maybe very known for you, across the street, you have also the landscape school. And as I said yesterday shortly, I think this is an architecture that, of the landscape, or landscape architecture, it doesn't really matter how you describe it, that really was able to produce climatic effects. And this is due to sheer scale, geometry as well. But at the end of the day, we're more interested in where is the real invention here in this setting where we are. And as I said yesterday, I think it's very much in the design of the gardens, the landscape, particularly the water features, many inventions that were actually linked to hydrology and how these water systems were connected and so on, were deeply interesting to us. But also the sheer scale of this water feature that I think you just need to take a stroll through the park to realize that some of these ponds actually have their own weather patterns. They have their own wave systems. They are so large that they almost behave like miniature oceans or lakes. And that was much more interesting to us than the architecture of the palaces and so on. At the same time, what is more interesting about the building is perhaps this connection with this. The first thing I thought when you told me about energy is like, this building is really horsepower. which might be or not something that comes from France. But you know, this building used to be the host of horses, and there were also many inventions that were linked to the capacity of that building to be able to sustain life in that way, the life of animals. So we were interested in animals and water. That's basically it, and the geometric system that allow this media to be, in a way, compatible with this very rigid architectural system. And that is actually geometry. This is obviously a time in which architects were not afraid of the word form. Geometry and form were not dirty words, as they might be nowadays. But what is interesting is that they were able to control also what I think are very sophisticated ways of engage with the fluidity of these media, both animals and water. So what we did, we decided to do a pond. I think it's interesting, like these commissions are always, why do we do them? Is it to move a conversation forward, or is it to transmit some kind of message to the students, or also to learn something ourselves? And we often want to do everything at the same time. It's a site-specific project in which we are trying to learn from the attitude towards geometry of these ponds. For example, here is, you see, there is some dust, some leaves that are collecting in the corner, something that might start happening at a different scale in our installation. And going back to also some historic references that have been important for us. This is a story that you might know or not. Thomas Church, if you Google now origins, the first modern garden in history is Thomas Church in California. You will probably see it in a encyclopedia right next to Versailles as something very important in landscape. It is known that the actual shape of the pool in Los Angeles was based on a visit by Church and his wife to Villa Mairea. Actually, the pool was not ready yet. They were informed by the drawing. So these are formal conversations through time and history that we're interested in. And some early studies, very simple, try to understand the shapes and the dimensions of the water features. You see where we are. The courtyard is tiny compared to these water features. It's more clear in this drawing. We were quickly interested in try to understand what will be the minimum area that we could cover with water that could somehow produce some kind of climatic change in the scale of the courtyard. It's not through a very scientific principle, by the way. I think it was not really it was only proven to us until I actually got in to put the horses in, that you feel that the water gets warm and it has a certain depth. But what we knew is that we wanted exactly 1,000 liters of water, and that the geometry would be somehow freely informed by some of these geometric qualities of the ponds. And the horses are just there. Of course, there is a connection with the building, but they are giving it scale. And this is also what we are learning. This is more selfish. This is what we are learning for a future project. It's also a model of a pond that we want to do. And at which point the pond starts to become like a small lake is something that is interesting to us. And that's when we decided to think that this is actually a 1:50 model. Yeah, that's when basically we understood that there is a change. You can see the steam. I don't think it has its own wave patterns as this space has. But I think ultimately what is interesting for you also, I guess for the students, is that it takes time to understand the qualities of those ponds in Versailles because they are so large that the geometry is very hard to grasp. So our model in the courtyard is a tool for you to try to imagine the former qualities and relate to them in a better way, because even though you're very close to them, it's not very easy to understand them until you actually see the model rather than the real thing. And that's what, and obviously has connections with some of our previous work that is also of a smaller scale. This is the installation that we did for the Frankfurt Book Fair a couple of years ago, in which tables behave also like strange furniture for books. And I don't know how much time left I have. Like, not much, I know. 10? Yeah, a bit more. Okay, so quickly, a project that is not about water, but I think it's ideal to explain how we work. And it's in Colombia. It's in a forest clearing of actually a quite quirky shape, not so different in scale than the pond that we were interested in. But in this case, the shape, the perimeter is a forest clearing. It's not a perimeter of water. And normally, at least in Colombia, where we often work, clients like to think that this is nature, but it's not. It's a forest clearing because of cattle. There were cows there. The cows compact the soil, they eat grass. The grass becomes an invasive species, which is very dominant, so it's very difficult to plant something there. And this grass, by the way, particularly this grass is brought from Australia, is extremely difficult for other plants to compete with that grass. There's also pines and eucalyptus that also make the soil acidic. So the idea that this is nature is false, and it's also very difficult to plant a garden here because it's as hard to do a garden here than as it will be in a desert. I'm sure that if we measure biodiversity in this floor, it will be higher than in that grass. It's a monoculture of grass. And we wanted to do a house for a client very special that could have done a larger house, but we quickly convinced him that it would perhaps be better to do smaller pavilion-like structures and use the budget, the energy, the time of a larger project into the garden, and to be able to really qualify this landscape as a meaningful also space for the house. Obviously in the tropics it's easier because many of the activities that can happen indoors can happen outdoors. But we wanted to test or to experiment how primitive can we go with architecture in terms of its construction, so that there could be time, energy, and budget simply in order to be able to do these gardens in this space that is actually quite unnatural, as I said. So we placed first these 2 volumes on the steepest side of the site. That's the geometry of the forest clearing. There will be a 3rd volume on the upper part. That's the forest clearing. And these 2 pavilion-like structures are connected by a single path. So people here have to move between them and therefore cross through these gardens. I'm not very fan of diagrams, but I think this explains how we work, which is that normally architecture is divided between, what we call in some countries wet works or black works and dry works, which is when you come with like all this stuff like drywall and stuff like that, and wood and softer materials. We like to think that in some contexts, and particularly in the tropics, it's easier to replace that later stage of the so-called dry works, all this world of drywall and stuff like that, and deviate that energy, because it takes time to detail that, deviate that energy into the garden. This is very important because we have one fee only. Landscape is very badly paid in most countries, but particularly in Latin America. So we need to use that fee, the same amount of hours for drawing, and be able to do a decent garden. So basically we use the resources from the interior into the landscape. It's a myth that everything grows in the tropics, particularly in a site like that. So the design of the landscape is a very technical thing, as technical as the house. It's a very high altitude place, so it's 2,100 meters above the sea level. And we wanted to create this fantasy garden that looks as if it's a bit higher. So that's the idea for the garden, basically to make it look as if we are in an alpine condition. That again requires, it requires energy, time, budget, introducing new species, introducing them slowly so that they can start to outcompete all these pines and eucalyptus that were brought because of forestry, replacing the soil, replacing the grass, and all that starts to reduce the area of the houses. But we don't like to think of these houses as minimal living, because the house in this case is the clearing, is not the little pavilions. And the garden needs to be designed also, needs to be able to change as we build, which is, and as I said, this grass needs to be, actually how they do it is they burn it, literally. And a lot of energy, in this case, goes into the garden. I keep talking about this because we often think of the design of the garden as something that goes in a kind of lower hierarchy in terms of budget and time, but in this case is completely horizontal with what it takes to make architecture. And then architecture, therefore, has to be extremely simple in its construction. We like concrete, and maybe this is, by the way, the connection with water. I think concrete is frozen water. We like this architecture that is poured, but yet still has very clear geometric inclinations. In this case, this house behaves as a kind of half retention wall to contain the terrain, otherwise it will go down. So the back of the house is a retention wall, and that's what it is. And when seen by the neighbors from the narrow side, it looks as a sort of water tank. This was very deliberate. It's a very private client. But that's not really what's important. We talk about how important it was for these houses not to look like houses, but as some kind of abstract structures in the garden. So yes, it's one house that is half sunken, defined by a retention wall. The gardens start to help define the topography. What I often think it's a kind of very Latin trick, which is that you can do a lot with topography, but because there is no winter, you can complete the topography with the vegetation that doesn't really change much in the winter. So you can make volumes out of vegetation that don't change, something that maybe we learn from Roberto Burle Marx. So we can trust that this vegetation will help all year round keep these houses more sunken. Geometry, again, I think the flat roof is very important in this case, and this straight line in contrast with the undulating line of the topography and the vegetation. But it's always in dialogue with the vegetation around the forest clearing and the garden. But every single decision is taken in terms of how these concrete walls can establish some kind of connection with that garden. So the kitchen, there is a rosemary garden and other herbs, very low. But it's not a very extroverted house. So one of them is the whole idea about this house is also that it's about the bathroom and the shower, which is in the back. Not very private. Everything is about that shower, basically. Lately, we introduced that curtain. There's only visual connection between that shower and the other shower. That's of the other house, but it's about 30 meters distance. And it's a different landscape. It's not the horizon in this case. It's the sun. It's a tropical sun that can be very sharp and that can draw very sharp images into the wall. But except that, it's very simple. It's stainless steel, very raw materials. And I think a lot has been said about linking the interior with the exterior, but we are also very interested in how the materials used in exteriors can go all the way to the most intimate spaces of a house. So you see this pattern of stones that happens in the terrace, but also in the sidewalks, gets repeated all the way into the bathrooms and the interior. So you can basically enter with shoes or pee in the floor, it's basically about the same floor outside and inside. With no hierarchy between the ground condition. That's something very important for us to link exteriors and interiors. Again, geometry, it's a single line. It reinforces the edge of the clearing, which is something important for us, while the house that is elevated is much more extroverted and is much more about relating with the forest clearing by being high up. Something important about this house, because it's located in the steepest side of the plot, it's possible to plant very small plants. That because you can look at them almost like in elevation, you can actually see bromelias and orchids, which you will not normally do from a house, that you will have to rely on trees. But yes, basically every single decision is trying to reinforce that connection. The water, for example, from the bathroom, there is condensation, so the support for the structure of the window allows the condensations to fall, but it's also the support for the soaps and stuff like that. So it's very much about letting the climate get in. If there is condensation or water or leaks, it goes out. All the floors have slopes towards the outside, even in the windows. Also trying to anticipate that it can be a house that might be empty for some time and not have a lot of maintenance. Very little furniture. The furniture is defined by the structure. This house is elevated 4 meters above the terrain, so the thickness of the beams defines the seating areas. This is what I told you before, when these gardens start to grow, a combination of wild plants that can finally compete with that grass, can take over the edge around the house. That tree that you see in the back is going to die probably very soon. Pines are not very good in the tropics. They grow too fast. The wood is not so good. So it doesn't really make sense to plan a view like this if you already don't have plans for the tree that will replace that tree. And this is the kind of game we are playing at the edge of the clearing. We take decisions based on important trees, but those trees will most likely die in the next 10 years. So we're already planting trees that will replace some of those trees. Okay, I think we'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So please, Mary, Steve, Anton and Debora, can you join us? We're going to bring some seats. We're supposed to have finished at 8, so I hope we're not going to be getting out of the place because of the technician. They're going to be patient with us. So, but we won't have so much time. So first, thank you very much for all of your contribution. I think at the very beginning of this exhibition with Nicolas, we had this reflection about starting from the parable of René Panam. You remember the rest about it. There is this hypothesis that thinking architecture in a new way, like directly from materials and energetical question, can make new forms emerge. Like new forms, of course, new shape of spaces, but also maybe new forms of climate. But in the same time, where either it is climate or spaces, it's a question of geometry. And in your different presentation, you told us about shape, geometry, and in a way, aesthetics. And it's I think, an important point for both of us to imagine that architecture, even if you imagine it in the current situation of climate changes and ecological emergency, can be aesthetics and talking about beauty in a way. And I mean, maybe this thesis we had is not from zero, and it's in a way starting from your work of you guys. And I think that the installation you've made for the exhibition is a proof that we were right. I mean, I hope so. So we have, maybe the first question could be, do you share our point? But maybe to be more precise, I have a question, a point that could be interested to discuss with you. It's about the relationship you have with the fabrication of architectural forms. Like at the beginning, Anton and Debora, your work is directly with a material question, like very primitive fabrication way of doing things, but at the same time you have this fabrica and this obsession in your work with prefabrication, pre-casting, and very technological way of manufacturing objects. In France, it's an history that is very important. Like we have the example of Gustave Eiffel, who was at the same time an architect and an engineer, and he led the company of construction. There's also the Frères Perret, the same example. And I think this idea is this relation with the way of fabricating forms. Like you marry, maybe you're from England, so maybe it's a way of the heritage of the arts and crafts, but you seem to have a relation very precise with the craftsmen. So how do you think, how do you include this relation to craft in your design process? That would be my question. Yes, to marry first, maybe.
I guess what the pavilion that we've designed was trying to do was answer that question and try to understand if we could redeploy the energy that goes into craftsmanship. So to understand what that actually means in the context of producing something that we've sort of reversed the process. So what we were trying to demonstrate through the making of the pavilion was that we needed to deploy more handmade work into achieving some of those details, rather than, if I'm saying this clearly, to make something through kind of highly manufactured processes with heat and, you know, manipulating steel, but you try to allow levels of craftsmanship to come into play through a kind of process of construction that's kind of finely tuned and comes out of the consideration of the material that's leading that process. Did that answer? In my head, that was clear. Does that answer your question?
It's clear, but maybe it could be interesting to share these points with Adrien, for example, because in your work you're using so oftenly like Hansson devices.
Yeah. No, it's. I guess we kind of like to orchestrate things, and that's what I was trying to say. How do we respond to your invitation? Finding the brief somehow, which is a bit unusual in this case usually. And how do you orchestrate somehow the different elements together? That's definitely something that interests us much more than, I would say, inventing a new language. Yeah, I believe it's somehow very classical what I'm saying, because it's about composition somehow, but composition with other elements perhaps, and perhaps the invitation that you propose is also questioning a bit the value of space. I mean, for us, it's not about engaging space as such, but engaging space as with, let's say, all different kind of agents. And I believe the question of energy is engaging these questions somehow, that you don't see space as something sculptural only, or something that is much more phenomenological, you know, that engage other ways of habits, of use, of comforts, and that's why we kind of like to, in our let's say hypothesis, to understand space through these different qualities.
So in our case, we do think a lot about form and definitely form associated to materials and where it comes from and geometry or not. If we think about two works that have been seminal to our itinerary, which are the truffle that we showed here and the Metascopian house, they both open avenues in our work that lead to apparently different places, but maybe not. And they deal with materials and form in very different ways because of the kind of questions that we are asking. In the case of a Metascopian house, we depart from a given technology, a series of elements that already come with their formal logics, and we just try to explore architecture and architectural form as a result, overcoming some of the preconceptions of how these prefab parts are usually used, right? And the Metascopian house results almost as a statement of how we can use standard elements in non-standard ways. In the case of the truffle house, we are trying to relinquish control, and we are trying to allow the material to almost speak by itself. And of course, we need to, we cannot completely reject design, of course. We are designing there the whole process of making this architecture and how materials come together, but almost as a recipe where the results could be, they would never be the same if we repeat it again, right? So there is not, this body of work is not about the final form, and we don't know what that final form is going to be just because of how the process is designed and laid out. And we really, we are very interested in this way of thinking and approaching architecture, because then it also opens a question about, perfection and beauty that is very interesting to us, right? And it develops an architecture that also, in our we think connects more sensibly with landscape, just because also of how landscape is understood as something that can be eroded and changes over time, and the idea of beauty, I think, that we apply to natural landscapes is definitely not the same that we apply usually to architecture. So again, for us, I think it's something that as we, in our work, we explore and we ask ourselves, and we don't have precise answers for it, but it's something that we definitely work on constantly.
Going to add an engineer's response to that question. We're in the middle of the fossil fuel era. There's unprecedented energy available to us to build with, to make stuff with. Never before in tens of thousands of years of building history has there ever been this much energy. So building with steel and concrete, producing these materials, using them in massive abundance has never happened before about 200 years ago. So you ask for a change of form or an architectural expression that represents a reduction in energy use. Everything that came before industrial coal extraction is that. There have been other periods as well. So Gothic architecture, for example, is incredibly expressive of an austerity of materials, very thin shells, forms that are mathematical. More recently, after the Second World War, there's a movement in Europe and in South America with Felix Candela, Claudio Dieste, Pierluigi Nervi, people like that, where they had a shortage of coal, they had a shortage of material, but actually they had an abundance of labor. So they have a lot of time, people to design, to make complicated formwork, to make shells, the sport campus in Rome, the formwork and the design of that is incredibly complex. And it's a fact that you can supplant material and energy with intellectual effort and physical effort of human beings and economize. And that has a very specific expression both in Gothic architecture and in the shell structures that those people were producing at that time.
can add something about also our piece. Luis mentioned like this water that you need to contain. I mean, I think that form is maybe not so related to that material. I think that is more the second layer of what is happening in that installation when you have this, when you make those choices that creates a very precise condition, like when the color of the pool, for example. To choose this darker color also enhances that effect that you will have with this evaporation, that it creates this like warmer condition. And you choose, and you need to choose like a certain amount of water, so it's not too much, so the thermal mass is not, you know, too much to be heated up for that to happen, but also not too little, so so you, if you want it to stay a little bit longer.
Thank you. Well, I'll ask a quick question. I have tons of them, but maybe a quick question because there are a lot of, well, and maybe after I would like also to have a question from the audience, so I'll do quick. I didn't mention that you, Luis and Charlotte, you also teach at the School of Oslo of Architecture, and in fact, actually, most of you are teachers in architecture, which is something that might be interesting for the students here. I also noticed that looking at your presentation tonight, you seem to all look for ways to invent protocols and protocols to define hierarchies and composition somehow of how our architecture can define itself. So more about finding forms, I would say that it's defining protocol that lead eventually to forms. My question would be if is it something that is this kind of process of working with this process of looking for protocols like that, it's something that is present in your teaching, and that you find it important to share with your students, or more broadly, what is the important thing that you want to share with your students? If not, but maybe Luis, I'd like to know about this.
Okay, well, Charlotte taught at Yale in architecture, and I taught at GSD architects and landscape architects, and also at AHU. And this is interesting because when you teach combinations of architects and landscape architects, you need to do something that is interesting for both. And that is a big challenge, because some of these conversations around architecture that might be really interesting among architects are completely outdated and uninteresting to landscape architects, and the other way around. For example, this stuff about being sensitive to the climate, even discussions about climate change in architecture, they come in waves. You know, 60s, 70s, then it fades, postmodern movements come, that becomes a separate question, then they come again. While in landscape architecture, the history of looking at environmental problems has been continuous. It's in the origins of the discipline. So what it's sometimes seen as innovation in architecture is tradition in landscape. It's a much younger field, smaller, but it started when professionals started to notice the Industrial Revolution, started to create problems in cities and so on. So it's a big challenge to do something that is shared. And I always say that form is the only shared language among designers. So when I approach the question of form and scale as something very free, then I can talk to them in the same terms without having to think about the separation between fields. But yes, it's form and scale as something that is, scale is plastic. We can move freely between them. The plan, by the way, as a projection is interesting because different than sections or elevations or axonometrics is the only projection also that allows these landscape architects to work with architects, because they can be quite sophisticated in their attitude to plan. While in other projections, they maybe lag behind. So it's something interesting. I mean, now it's very specific, but that's in terms of technique and teaching attitudes when when teaching both architects and landscape architects. I think what is common nowadays is that more architects are interested in live matter, in stuff that is alive, plants, trees, animals. We saw it today, it's not only us. So it's easier, but there's also more competition, which is also interesting. But then the landscape architects also need to be more formally skilled in a way, in order to be able to compete with the architects that are more interested in the media that used to be only the landscape architects issue. I find it fascinating. In this context, it's also interesting, you know, I find it quite beautiful that the architects are in the building that the horses used to be, while the landscape architects are in the building with the royal gardens. And I don't know if you have actually a lot of connections. Maybe you should have more, but this is the kind of things that are interesting to me. Yeah.
I'd like to know that, yes, Anton, because you teach in the MIT, and your point of view on these teaching questions, interesting to us. Need to have it closer.
Yeah, the students for Ensemble Studio have been the ensemble. I mean, we have done everything with our students that became later on our partners and our colleagues. So education is not only what happens here in school. It's, you know, a constant life of learning, no? And that's what architecture is. But I think, connecting with your first question, the most important mission of educators is to tell the students what architecture is, and after try to share with them the discovery of the fundamental questions of today. And I think the fundamental questions of today, and this is what we share with our students, are the ones that have to be dealt and that have to be, you know, tackled. The fundamental questions of today, in our humble opinion, is that we are in a very extraordinary moment of the history of architecture. I think it's an inflection point, actually, where we are all considering that a building could be fabricated rather than built. And this is a technical and aesthetical problem that is unprecedented for the history of architecture. This is something to consider, research-wise. The second thing that is also part of the esprit du temps is a very special and urgent sensibility towards our Earth. And this is not only a parametric problem to solve, no, of reduction, increase, waste here, there. No, it's also a cultural and an architectural problem. No? And the third one is, and this is for you guys, for the students, that maybe technology can take your job, as you know it today. No? If you only think that architecture is about doing the design, that will be easily pre-manufactured by software and by all kinds of, you know, apps that will provide, you know, accumulated knowledge through algorithmic patterns that might solve, you know, certain aspects of the design, being the design just the plan drafting, or to produce some structural re-engineering, or to do, you know, an energy model. That would be solved by technology. What will never be solved by technology is the understanding of what architecture is today and what has to be. You know, that's esprit du temps, that I think it's a fundamental architecture motto, that connects art and technology. And in the middle of these two appears our work. So I think these are the questions that we should share with the students.
Maybe that's time to ask indeed the audience if there are some questions that you would like to ask, and I think it's the good moment to do it. As always, people are shy. I can't believe you don't have questions. They are waiting for the cocktail to ask the questions, maybe. But I was wondering, Anton, in the MIT, do you experiment with the materials like you do in the Fabrica, for example, or just the studio you're teaching is more about I don't know, it's on computers or whatever?
Well, we same in Ensemble Studio or in the Fabrica or at MIT. Actually, my course is called The Architecture of the Earth, like this lecture, because that's what we have been advocating, what we have been working and researching. So the material tests, schools generally don't allow certain escapes or practices, unfortunately. Fabrication laboratories that should be the fundamental atelier type of every school, are not, the prime, let's say, objectives or spaces in the curricula. So I would say that our educational impact occurs in La Fabrica. When you visited us, we were, trying to conceive as a material, structural, and artistic combination. And you saw of ambient that we were creating. Some of them were our collaborators, just from Erasmus, from all over the place. I think the combination between school and practice is the best educational experience.
I mean, something interesting that we have observed, which was a surprise to us, honestly, when we started the laboratory in MIT, the Pop Lab, we started to do studios that would bridge academia and our research. And so we would do studios that were based on research projects we were actively doing in the lab. And those were successful, but not as successful as when we research in our own house and we have, our staff, our people, and then we also engage students that come with exchange programs from the universities, etc. We don't know exactly the reason. We feel that, at least in the US, the profile of a student maybe is different from some of you guys, but they want to work on their own projects. They want to build their own portfolio. And this creates sometimes, a difficult condition where we found that in the university sometimes it's more successful to use our own methodologies, but introduce topics that maybe are not so directly connected, right? So that's why now what we've done is to also maybe produce studios, like summer studios, where we bring the students to Canterra or Fabrica, the spaces that we showed, and they are in our space, so they understand that that's the kind of environment where they are, and they are committed to that type of projects. But for us, it's we're always very interested in, of course, teaching the students what we do and who we are, but finding the successful ways that where they will be really enriching from it. And it's not always so clear, depending on the type of student and where they come from.
I will add something brief, because it's about our work, but also the students. And it's, again, about scale. And I think to engage with the environment in a meaningful way, you need to act at a certain scale. You cannot just do small things. And in order to avoid going too large with architecture, that's when you can start to work with trees, plants, and so on. So the teaching and also the work is also very much about knowing where to stop with architecture and then continue with the media of landscape in order to avoid overly large structures. Which also, of course, if we're interested in concrete, it doesn't make any sense environmentally to go too large. So we're trying to reduce the dimensions in architecture in order to be able to complete the task with the landscape. And that is only possible if students and us have some decent degree of plant literacy, knowing about plants and the media of the landscape that is particular to the landscape. Otherwise, the structures start to take over. And this is different, because the media for expression needs to be, in this case, the media that is alive. And that's very much in our teaching and in our practice. It's working across these two boundaries.
I think we need to. You want to add something, Mary?
I suppose what's sort of going through my mind, and this is quite possibly a UK concern, is that there's, within education, there's a real drive and a real curiosity that's sort of driven through the programs at university, and agendas that are very much sort of bedded into researching about material qualities, about energy, etc. But somewhere in that process and those investigations, there is a move then into practice, and practice is where we are causing lots of damage, and the move between what's learned and what's documented doesn't find, unfortunately, its place in practice. And that's something that I kind of really struggle with. And I think in this project, what I've learned from it is that you can, if you really push yourself sort of as a practitioner, because the practitioners, I think, really need to test themselves and take the energy and channel it into changing procurement, changing how you think about materials, how you take a material and your knowledge from a drawing and just don't simply rely then on its production, but rather how it's produced, whether it needs fire, doesn't need fire, how you're going to deploy that knowledge into the development of kind of architecture that's, there's lots of it. There's lots of things that need to be built in a very responsible way. And I'm not quite sure that we're doing that yet. I'm not quite sure that we're making that leap and adopting the right processes to fully engage with it, jumping from academia and research into real world. I don't mean to sound negative.
We can all make the effort to try to do it better.
The students will make those efforts.
So we need to leave the auditorium right now because it's running late, but I would love to continue the conversation outside around a glass of wine, maybe.
Glass and dinner, Marie-Hélène. And
obviously all the students and people in the room, you can join, and I would like, if you'd like to, don't hesitate. I think everybody will be okay to ask questions to our amazing guests, because it's not so often that we have so amazing people here in Versailles. Well, we have great people in Versailles.
We have great people.
I'm tired. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
really difficult.